My wife and I, for the last 2.5 years, have been living on the West Coast. We were in Seattle for about 1.5 years. We've been up in Northern California and Berkeley for the last 6 months or so. And we left Washington, D.C., where we'd been for the preceding 8 or 9 years for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons was that our youngest son had just gone to college, and so we were more or less free. We missed him, but we were free to tour the world again. I had a somewhat oddball assignment, or oddball project, which I'll tell you about if you ask, where for several months I worked inside Microsoft inventing what I described as a good word processing program. I thought that was something they could use to add to their arsenal, and so I was trying to say, if you had a word processing program that was actually designed for writing, what would it look like? So we had a reason to go to Seattle. We ended up staying in Seattle for a while because we liked it. We found weather like what we're experiencing today, 300 days a year, to be an interesting way to live, which is the Seattle way. But we were there. We've come to California, but we are preparing in various ways to go back to Washington, D.C. this fall for where I'm going to be doing reporting on politics for the Atlantic again. As we've considered doing that, many of the things which are horrible about national political journalism have begun to flood my consciousness again. I thought, what about seeing versions of the McLaughlin Group on the street, seeing these people walk around? What about being part of this sort of snake pit where people are only concerned about one or two narrow political topics? How won't this seem less interesting than the broad world that the rest of the country lives in? So I mention this in context that one of the things which is discouraging about journalism is the way at its sort of elite levels, the people who are on TV, who get the most notice in the field, it's about such a narrow range of things, of who's in and out politically. More deeply, and as I try to explain at some length in my book, one of the things that's happened in journalism to cause a negative impression is a series of economic evolutions. When I was in undergraduate school, I studied American history. When I was in graduate school, I studied economics. And I do think that economic history is usually a way to explain much of what goes on in different fields and different cultures. And I think you can see this in contemporary journalism, the way economic incentives have changed what people do. I'll give you a couple of illustrations of this. At the individual level, there's been a big change in big-time journalism over the last generation or two. By big-time journalism, I mean TV, news magazines, working for national newspapers, etc. A generation or two ago, the expectation of people going into journalism was sort of like that of people going into government. You knew that you were not going to make big money this way, but you thought you'd make an okay living. You knew that on the long haul you'd be below, say, doctors and lawyers and corporate officials on the flight path of money, but there'd be other kinds of satisfactions that made you think it was worth your doing. In the last generation or so, much of that has changed, where some people in journalism have been able to make significant money. And the way they've done it essentially has been by merging the fields of normal print journalism and TV celebrityhood. There's been in the last 15 years an explosion in the industry of TV talk shows. You turn on a cable network, that's what you see. One reason you see it is it's the cheapest possible thing for cable networks to put on. You get a bunch of journalists on there and sit them in a room for half an hour, and it costs you not much. But for them, it's financially valuable because going on the TV shows then lets you go on the corporate speaking circuit, et cetera. It can make you more of a celebrity. So from the individual journalist point of view, there's been a shift in kind of the matrix of the business where it's a more, like professional sports, like some other things, it's become a more sort of money-conscious business and with a greater premium on individual TV-born celebrity. So that's a change that's made for some problems. There's been a shift in the business environment, the economic environment for journalistic entities themselves. It was often the case, say 30 or 40 years ago, that journalism, one way or another, was shielded from the market. The news divisions of CBS or NBC were run as sort of as their kind of their own little public television offerings. Within their corporate parents, they weren't supposed to make big profits. They've become, subject to more just standard corporate discipline now, both for good and bad. It's good that they have bigger budgets, but bad that they're under more intense pressure just to bring in the quarterly quarterly returns. You see the same thing for newspapers too, where they were typically in the olden days more family ownership and less subject to having to have the quarterly returns. Now they're more on they're just like another corporation. You find mergers happening where there were fewer independent entities, et cetera, et cetera. And so you find in general, and I won't belabor this anymore, that journalism becoming just another business, just like selling shoes, just like making movies. And some of the things which seem to be unusual about journalism were harder to preserve. Let me explain this point just a moment more. All of us, I think, have recognized that, that market disciplines, market incentives are valuable things. That's what the Soviet Union learned when it went from being the Soviet Union to Russia. It's what the East Germans learned when they joined Germany. But there are certain aspects of life which I think our experience tells us aren't best done in a pure corporate model. I don't think pure corporate education is the ideal. We have a variety of alternatives to that. We have public schools, we have church-related schools, we have things that aren't just pure corporate model. The same is true for medical care, where it's not all run just on a corporate model. And I think there's a reason to believe that the news is not best run on a pure corporate model. There are some ways that should be sheltered from the market, but things are moving in the other direction. There are other reasons for concern, of which I'll mention only one, and because it affects the world in which you all as students are living right now. And that is the tone that certain kinds of news coverage can give to the way we view the outside world. Let me explain what I'm talking about. Most of you have probably seen stories in the last 3 or 4 years about how the crime rate has gone down, and it has really gone down over the last decade, as you know. It was already going down, say, 6 or 7 years ago. The changes had already started that were bringing the crime rate down. But if you looked at TV news, especially local TV news, you'd get the impression in San Diego, in Los Angeles, in Dallas, in Miami, wherever you went, you would get the impression that if you walked outside your house, you're going to be gunned down by random assailants, just because what was on TV news was just sort of nonstop car crash, killing, rape, and tornado. Because there were always enough of those things happening someplace you could fill the evening news. And became demonstrable that people thought, because of local TV news, that the world was a lot worse than it was, that things were a lot more dangerous than they were. Something similar is happening right now, I think, with economic news. In the month of January, the month in which, if you follow the papers, the NASDAQ fell to very low levels because tech stocks have been devalued. Lots of companies were laying people off. In that month of January, more Americans found new jobs than lost their jobs. The unemployment rate in the month of January was the lowest it had been since 1968. Just by any sort of reasonable measure, this is still an extraordinarily prosperous time, but the tone of emphasis on layoffs and general economic gloom, I think, is the equivalent of the crime scare of 7 or 8 years ago, making people think that things are worse than they actually are. Without saying more, let's assume for the moment there are reasons for concern about the state of journalism. Let me shift to reasons for optimism. Now, talk first generally from the point of view of the reading public, the viewing public, the citizen public, and then more specifically about people considering this as a line of work and what you might find satisfying about it. Let me just tick off a number of reasons to think why we might expect something. If you wanted to make a case for better living through journalism, a better situation for journalism, what would be the evidence you would look to? These are a variety of different reasons, but here they are. One reason is sometime Bill Clinton is going to go away. And let me explain what I mean by that. I actually I've known Bill Clinton for a long time. I think he was a very effective president in a number of ways, but his effect on the news business has been 100% negative. His effect on the news business has been to generate a steady stream of National Enquirer-type stories, including literally a National Enquirer story today about the Hugh Rodham payoff scandal. And sometime this will stop, we assume. Let's assume there's not going to be, okay, we may have another 6 months of pardon stories, but we're not going to have another 6 years of pardon stories. Sometime the scandal meter will turn down on the Clinton household. And we'll be left with a government in Washington, the George W. Bush government, that I did not personally vote for. I don't know that it's going to succeed in various ways, but it could be good for journalism in this way. It's going to put out less of the tabloid stuff, I predict. And so journalists will be sitting there with things, with time on their hands, and they won't have Monica, they won't have Linda Tripp, they won't have Hugh Rodham, they won't have Mark Rich, and they'll have to do something. And there's been a kind of ferment in national journalism in the last few years about other things they might do. Some of the journalism prizes are going for more interesting explanatory pieces about how the world actually works. And so while some of this energy that's left over by the end of the Clinton scandals will go just towards telling us who's going to run for president in 2004, some little bit of it might be left over for other things. So that's one reason for optimism. There'll be a little bit of spare journalistic energy that we can use that can be applied to something interesting about the world. There's a crucial thing I should explain right here. When I say something interesting, let me tell you what I mean. When I travel around as a reporter, I am continually amazed by how big and rich and diverse the world is. A couple of days ago, I was up at the Lawrence Livermore laboratories outside Berkeley, where I'm living, seeing some gigantic new machines some people are inventing there for a new generation of semiconductor chip. This is something that hasn't been covered in any of the papers, and it's just interesting to see. And the range of things in the world to talk about, other than Newt Gingrich, Tom Daschle, Trent Lott, and the kind of snake pit in Washington, it's so vast that if some energy can be devoted towards explaining this whole world, that's a plus. So I think there'll be something devoted there. A second reason for optimism. Some of you might find these strange reasons, but I'll try to make them more plausible. Second reason is the result of the election we've just been through. We've seen in the election some of the basic mechanics of our system of government in an unusual display. All of us think about the Electoral College in a different way than we did before. All of us know the word Chad. There was a headline in the San Francisco newspaper a day or two ago saying, California to stick with Chad voting. Who would have known what that headline meant 3 months earlier? Now we all know what it means. But we also know some basic things about the mechanics of democracy, who gets to vote, who doesn't, how they're counted. And so one implication of the election, journalists, like generals, are always fighting the last war. So journalists may spend some more time on these sort of issues of the structure of democracy. That would be good. A third reason for optimism may sound slightly contradictory to what I said before, but nonetheless I will say it, which is that some parts of the national economy are likely to be less perfect in the next couple of years than they've been in the last few years. The economy in the last few years has not been perfect, but it's been strong. And it's likely to be more complicated in its strengths and weaknesses in the next few years than before. For example, the trade deficit the U.S. has had is at astronomical levels. Journalism is often at its best when the economy is having troubles, because that's a big issue that affects everybody, and people in our business often do a good job of trying to explain what's happening to your job, what's happening to your savings, what's happening to your taxes. And so there's a reason to think that something we do well can be brought out by challenges to the whole economy. Extending that reason to another and more substantial point, it is certain that in the next 5 years, the next 10, the next 20, science, technology, biotechnology, infotechnology, all these things will play a larger and larger role in our lives, and not simply through matters of dot-com finance and who is starting what company and becoming a billionaire. This too is something where there will be, I think, a public hunger for understanding how things work. What does genetically engineered food actually mean? What is mad cow disease, and how does it actually spread? But more broadly, how does the intersection of the world of scientific knowledge, the world of engineering expertise, and the world we live in, how does that mesh This also will give more of a sort of market demand for journalists to tell about things that matter, that are part of this big, interesting world I'm describing. Another reason for optimism is, again, the other side of something I was mentioning as a reason for concern. I mentioned earlier that news is becoming more just a business. Something that's true of businesses in the United States is they are extremely diverse. If you're looking for shoes, you can get them at some, $10 a pair shoe store. You can get them at a very expensive shoe store. If you're looking for restaurants, there's a whole range of restaurants from the most elite to the most mass. The same, I think, will become true of news. There will be a range from the big mass products, which will be very infotainment-oriented, and there'll be the very high-end products, the equivalent of the fancy restaurant, the equivalent of the elite college, the equivalent of the very expensive shoe store. And those high-level journalistic publications, I think, will become better and better. I think the New York Times, which is essentially the national newspaper, becomes better and better. I work for the Atlantic Monthly, which I think is becoming better and better. There will be a high end of news. It's too bad that the mass publication will be becoming more infotainment-like, but the top end will be getting better, and that at least is some consolation, I think. Two other reasons for optimism before I get to my sales pitch for why you should join this field, and these are ones that will be of direct impact on those of you who are students now. One of them is the role of the internet. I feel like killing myself as I say those words because for the last 5 years we've all heard the internet will change X, Y, and Z. There's things the internet will change, there are things that it will not change, things that are slow, things that will be fast. But I think the impact of the internet on news is likely to be important and mainly good. I say mainly good because you can imagine some problems the internet will bring, and it has already brought. It makes it easier for kind of anonymous tipsters to come up with any theory they wanted and put it on the internet. It makes it harder for large-scale publications to have a mass audience and address all of us. It's harder to be the equivalent of Life magazine when I was a kid that most Americans read. Nonetheless, those, I think, are small problems compared to the benefits the internet has brought. Let me make this specific for any of you who is a journalism student. 20 years ago, if you wanted to conceive of starting your own publication, you had to be either rich or crazy. If you were rich, you could do it because you could then have the money to sink into starting a magazine or newspaper. If you were crazy, then either this would just be in the fantasy world, or you'd live the kind of crazy life that my friend Charles Peters has lived in starting the Washington Monthly magazine, where he pays people $6,000 or $7,000 a year to get them to work for him, and they're supposed to do it for love. He's paid himself about $15,000 a year for the last many decades, and he does it because he loves it. Those were the options in the era of print. In the era of the internet, basically any of you can start your own publication as your own website. Probably some of you have done it. You're able to find out information about the whole world. You're able to find out a variety of voices that you couldn't find out before. So I think it is worth giving serious attention to the leverage the internet gives every one of you in this room. It allows you to find out things you couldn't find before and allows you to speak in a way you couldn't. And that is a tremendous privilege that was just unavailable to people. The final reason for optimism about the business is something which you all who are journalism students here exemplify. While I've been in Berkeley, I've been doing a little seminar at the journalism school at UC Berkeley there, and it's made me feel just excited about the future of the business when I see the kind of people who want to be in it. These are people smart enough and ambitious enough that they could be going to some tech company, or they could be going to corporate law firms or whatever and making a lot more money, but they are curious to find out about the world and tell about the world to the rest of the public, and that is the reason for being optimistic. This is a business which, more than any other you can think of, continually remakes itself. Almost every important development of journalism you can trace to some particular person who said, I'd like to tell a story this way. For example, Time magazine, you've all seen Time magazine. Time magazine was started by somebody about the age of most of you who are students here. When Henry Luce and Britt Haddon graduated from college in 1921, I believe it was, and 21 and 22, they decided to start a magazine right out of college. And they did it, and the magazine they founded was Time Magazine. When John Hersey was pretty soon out of college, he was pioneering a kind of narrative writing in Hiroshima, in the New Yorker. It's people who are young and see the world differently who have remade journalism, and that is what keeps it alive, as many lines of work cannot keep themselves alive. So there are reasons to be optimistic about this business. They're partly silly ones, like the disappearance of Bill Clinton. They're partly technological ones, like the rise of the internet. But fundamentally, they are human ones, that people like you are considering going into the field, and you can remake it. Finally, why should you consider going into this field? Why does somebody like me, who was in your position 30 years ago, coming out of college, decide to do this, and why would I make the same choice again now if I had to do it over again? I'll give you the reasons, but first I'll give you an indication of how attractive I think this line of work can be. I mentioned earlier that I spent a couple of months working at Microsoft, trying to design this new version of Word, parts of which will be released later this year. And it was a really interesting thing to do, to work inside the evil empire itself, to see that the people walking the halls, they were actually, while they were, many of them were just kind of geeks and oddballs, on the whole they were nice. It was an interesting and surprising experience. And at the end of that time, they said, why don't you stay and do this? Why don't you stay and help us evolve the future generations of Word? And it would have meant going on to an entirely different financial flight path from the one that one knows as a magazine writer, even given the subsequent travails of Microsoft stock. But it didn't seem worth it because it wasn't interesting enough. It couldn't compare in sort of the variety of experiences to what journalism can offer. So that's the most sincere way I can illustrate that I really do think this is the most interesting way to live your life. But let me try to tell you more specifically what is satisfying. There are a couple of main ways that a life in journalism can be more interesting than other lives you have. I'll mention them in principle, then I'll give you illustrations from a book I've just finished, which will be out in a couple of months, of what I mean. I think there are three things that can make a life in journalism uniquely satisfying. The first of them is, essentially, you get to live several people's lifetimes in one life. Here's what I mean. You get to go out and see people. You get to go to a laboratory where people are inventing giant machines, and you spend a week listening to them, and they've spent 20 years doing this, but in a week you kind of squeeze out the interesting juice from what they're doing, and then you go do something else. You can go beyond an aircraft carrier. You can go into Microsoft. You can go to Mali. You can go to different parts of the world. You see people who have spent their whole lives developing this expertise. You try to learn from them, and then you do something else. There are disparaging ways to describe this outlook on life. You can call it dilettantism. You can call it a bathtub mind, where you fill it up and then you empty it and you do something else. But essentially, I find that it makes life longer. It makes life richer. I think the density of life depends on how many experiences you have, I think, with people and with the world. And journalists can have more than most people. So that is one reason why, if that's part of your makeup, if you recognize this personality when I'm describing and don't just think it's a psychopathic personality, then you may find this satisfying. A second reason why journalism can be really exhilarating, but also somewhat scary, but more exhilarating, is that the limits, unlike a lot of lines of work, the limits on how good a job you do and how much force for good or ill that job has are mainly within you. They're not the organizations, they're not somebody's outside rules, they're essentially how well you can do things. You can imagine people working in some kind of large civil service job or large bureaucratic job where they can't do much about how the organization behaves. There are rules, there are procedures, they're there to fill them out. And certainly there are constraints in any part of journalism too. But essentially, every time you investigate a story, every time you write something, every time you prepare something for broadcast, It's like you're a baseball player taking a turn at bat. It's like you're a gymnast lining up to run for the pommel horse, whatever they're called. You are trying to see if your skills are up to it this time. And how good a job you do really depends on what you can figure out in terms of what to look for, what to explain, how clearly you can convey it to your readers. This is frightening in the way that being a baseball batter is frightening, because you have the risk of embarrassment if you strike out, you have the risk of getting hit by a ball, etc. But many people feel exhilarated and alive by the challenge of having to swing at the pitch each time, having to judge the pitch. And I find it satisfying as the years go by to be in a situation where if it's good or if it's bad, it's my doing, one way or the other. And if it's bad, I know that I need to do something different, and it's not some kind of corporate responsibility. Finally, a satisfaction in journalism is that you have a sense that if you do your job well, it can make some difference. The only way people know about parts of the world they haven't seen themselves is if journalists tell them. If you read books, if you read newspapers, if you see TV shows, that's the only way you know what Tokyo looks like if you haven't been there. Or the only way you know what people are thinking in Dallas, Fort Worth, or whatever. And since these images we have of how the world works, if it's getting better, if it's getting worse, since they are important in the way people live their lives and the way democracy works, then it matters how journalists do their job. I have one final part of my presentation, and then I'll be happy to answer your questions. That's to apply the three principles I was just giving you to a project I just finished, not one this last night, but a couple of weeks ago with a book, and show you what it means in real life. I have a book coming out later this spring the title is Free Flight, Inventing, I think the subtitle is something like Inventing the Future of Transportation. This is a book about people who are inventing an entirely different way to travel by air. They're going to solve airline hell as they see it. They're inventing a new kind of system that will move people around the air. I mentioned before that journalism is satisfying because it's interesting. I've been able to spend time the last year or two with people whose lives are involved with finding out why airplanes crash and how to make them so they don't crash, how to make engines that never fail, et cetera, et cetera. That is just interesting. I mentioned that it's a matter of that you have this sort of exhilaration of being a baseball batter, of facing the challenge yourself. And I was trying to say there are technical problems here that I think are fascinating. So the challenge to me is, can I make them interesting to people reading this book? And I've done my best. And then there's a question of effect. I think that if people read this, they'll have an idea they didn't have before about how they might travel around differently, whether there's a way to avoid the airline situation, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll give you more details if you want later on. Essentially, my point is, for those of you who are thinking of this line of work, you should consider it the way you do life in America, life in these times, life at all. That is, it has its complications, but it's worth the effort. And if you know that if you put yourself into it, it can bring you satisfactions that you might not get other ways. So if you take no other message from this session than this one, and that probably is the case, but here's the message. You heard from a guy who decided 30 years ago, when he was in college, to give this line of work a try, and he's very happy he did. And he suggests that if you give it a try too, then 30 years from now, you will end up feeling happy about it as well. So thank you for having me here. Good luck with your studies in journalism, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.